Welcome to our one-to-one. This is an interview between Chris Smith, director whose Black Death opened at the end of May in the UK, and Dan Gibson, who is a short film director and is about to start production on a short film called Ella for the UK Film Council.
I guess start at the beginning. I noticed that you've done a couple of shorts.
Well, the first film was The 10,000th Day, which I did when I was doing an MA at Bristol University. And it was the graduation film. And it was kind of like I called it at the time like a little Paul Auster kind of numerology kind of a story about God obsessed with numbers and how numbers can affect your life. So it had that, it kind of was weirdly, when I look back at it now, it's kind of like a precursor in a way to Triangle. It's very kind of odd. It's very much a sort of little student film in the sense that the ideas are kind of very madcap. But it was it kind of did well in competitions and kind of got me to the attention of the local TV station who invited me in to see if I was working on anything. And I rather cynically, I admit, I'd come up with a storyline which I believed would work for their kind of what will they want, their audience, but also their kind of what would their funding policy be. So I set this kind of Ken Loach, Alan Clark kind of drama in one of the poorest estates in Bristol. Had written this script, so as I turned up, they were like, "Oh, we're looking for something maybe set around," and I said that estate, and they went, "Oh yeah." So I used that as a way to, I kind of cleverly and cynically, a little bit cynically, tried to target that. And then from that point on, I then went off and started writing features. I wrote a feature called Chameleon, which in the end never got made, but brought me to the attention of people like in the Film Council, the film consortium at the time that was there. And this was around the time that Neil Marshall had just released Dog Soldiers, and there was a very big appetite for horror movies. And I'd, it's quite well known as a huge horror fan, and I hadn't actually thought of making a horror for my first film, but as soon as someone said you should make a horror movie, I'd been working on the idea of Creep for a while. So I wrote Creep, and then these, obviously then, when you go to see the Film Council or any film company with a how do you get your first feature made, they want it to be okay. They want to make the film. They're not trying to find reasons not to. They're trying to find reasons to justify it in a way. So they liked the script. They then looked at the two short films, and the first one was kind of quite stylishly done in terms of camera angles and shots. It was very much, a student film in that respect. The second one was an acting-led film, so it kind of ticked the two boxes, which are the fears I think the industry can have on working with first-time feature film directors, is can they direct actors and can they tell a story? So it all kind of worked out very well in the end.
Okay, that's cool. So I guess that all of that stuff led to you being offered Creep. I was really interested in, because obviously I presume had you ever been on a feature film set before you made Creep? Or?
No, I worked for a while on the Barry Norman show, which was the kind of Sky version of film 2010. I worked on that for 3 years, so I'd done a lot of set visits. So in terms of the only experience I'd had of being on film sets was really watching other directors do it while I was making a film about them filming it. So I don't know how much that taught me in the sense of the big machine of a feature. But I think the hard thing in terms of the step from shorts to features for me is not the onset thing of working with the crew you see. It's all the things that go behind it that you don't see. That you don't. If you only had a morning to shoot a scene on a short film, and you suddenly get 2 days to shoot a scene on a feature, you think, great, I've got more time. But if that scene actually needs 4 days to shoot it, and you don't have the kind of experience or the kind of not arrogance, but the kind of ballsiness to say straight away, actually, I need more time for that.
Yeah.
You can end up trying to please, and I think the thing is not to try to please, but always to stay truthful to the.
I guess each time, from that, each time you do a feature film, you kind of learn something more about time and how to use it.
Yeah.
As possible.
I heard Scorsese he calls himself a film student because film is bigger than anybody. You can never. When you're in pre-production, I've joked when we were in pre-production, we've said, I wonder what mistakes we're making now, because you don't think you're making any, but you are making some, and you don't know what it is you're doing that's a mistake. Have you got enough? Have you ordered enough equipment? Have you got the right lenses? Have you got is that beat of the story? Does it come too soon in the script? Does it come too late? And, it's brilliant though. That's what makes the job so brilliant, is that you know, it's permanently it's a permanently changing thing. And then you start to make the movie. And this is another thing I don't think people realise. When you read, you read your Empire magazine or your Total Film, and I used to be a fan and used to consume magazines like that. You don't know that when you, in your mind, you may have a scene for, let's just say with Creep, we had a scene in an underground station. I had written the script for a year thinking what that will look like. And unless you're Stanley Kubrick and can build the whole thing, it's going to look like what it looks like in Charing Cross Station. So all these little things change gradually from what you have in your head to what you end up with. And I love that process I see it as growth. But
once you'd done Creep, I guess because you made your first film, I guess it did quite well. I presume it did. It seemed like it did quite well. How did that impact your career in getting more work? Obviously people trusted you more?
Well, there's a real balance, I think, between, there's a balance between, obviously the fact it did well, because it took about 2 million in the cinema, and then, even better on DVD. So that obviously had a big impact in the sense that you suddenly appear on one of the invisible lists of people that can do a certain horror movie. There are lists that go around, and it's not just lists of whether or not it's not about how good you are. It's about, have you delivered a film? So when a financier will look at who's actually directing it, they'll have a list of people who says, "Well, Neil Marshall's doing it." You know that Neil Marshall will deliver you a good horror movie. Yeah. If so it makes it easier for the financiers to find a reason to do it. So, but for me, what was great again with that was it was back to back with Creep. So Creep. The hard thing about making your first feature is that you discover very quickly, and Barry Norman taught me this, that you're actually in amongst all the big boys in the sense that you're going to get reviews, and some will be good and some will be bad, and it's that first thing is a real kind of woof, really hits you. So I was lucky in the sense that even though we had some kind of bad reviews, we had some good ones too for Creep, because the box office was good, it all became good, and the end result was all good. It's quite hard to deal with that to begin with, and you become a bit more thick-skinned as you go on.
Yeah.
But it meant that when I came to Severance, I'd had a track record of one film had worked. It made the second one come easier, and then the second one, I think was more successful, certainly critically, and the same successful success theatrically. So, it put me in a good position for trying.
I remember hearing you say something that when you're in a tight spot on a scene, you try to think of how they solve the problem in another film.
If you're up against it and you're in a scene and how do you solve the problem where in your story the actor has to do this and this, and you've only got a little bit of time left. And look at the scene. The most famous example is Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark. The scene when he pulls the gun and shoots the guy with the sword, and he just goes bang and shoots him. It was a huge storyboarded fight with his whip when he manages to get the guy off with the whip. And because they had no time, Spielberg said, "I'll just take your gun out and shoot him." And what I learned from that was they always find what's the scene really about. So if you really have to make those cuts, what's the scene really about? And we had a very similar thing on the tank in Australia. We had a kind of velociraptor style, but a completion guarantor who was kind of like on me, just waiting on me all the time. And she walked onto this huge tank we had, with water tank, where we were filming the scene where everyone's surfacing on the boat of the upturned yacht. She said, "You've got to get off of here in 3 hours." And I knew that I had to do a scene where the characters dive underwater to try and rescue the other ones. And actually all the scene was really about, when I looked at it in my head and really up against it with the clock on me, was just about what is Melissa feeling when all this chaos is going on around her. So I managed to get off the tank in 3 hours. I changed it on the spot and made it just on her face. And it's actually one of my favourite scenes in the movie. So. It could have just been, and if I'd have had a tantrum and said, "Oh, there's no way, I have to do this," I should have just said, "Well, you're not doing it." And that's the hard thing you have to learn with filmmaking, is you're free when you're writing your script, you're not free the moment that you especially, and the bigger they get, the bigger the production around you gets. If they shut down the water tank's gone. You can't go and fix it somewhere else. Another good thing with features, another thing to remember, the difference between your schedules for shorts and features is that we shot Black Death in order, and one great piece of advice that I think I've self-learned is, if you get to the great privilege and pleasure of being able to shoot your movie in order, always shoot the end and the beginning on the second week. Don't shoot the end of the beginning in order, because what happens is your crew's not up to speed and you're not up to speed on day one, which is when you're beginning with me, and you're always rushing at the end.
Yeah.
So we ended up doing it quite well. We did it exactly in order, actually. So I did the very first thing you see in Black Death was the first day, and the very last thing was the last thing. And here's a bit of advice: always shoot it after 2 weeks. Then you can change it if you need to. So.
Just with actors, I was just wondering how you kind of work with actors and prepare them for their roles.
Actors, when I was growing up, I wasn't into football till I was about 20, and actors for me were like my football stars, so I've always been I love actors, genuinely, so and I think that vibe wears off on them, that they kind of know that I really love what they do, and I love how they do it, so I always come along with a huge amount of respect and enthusiasm. In terms of them preparing, what the better the actors, or the more, not better, but as soon as you stop making shorts, and you know, again, assuming that with some of the shorts you're working with people you know and friends in college, and however good or whatever those actors might be, they don't have the experience often of the way the camera works that some seasoned screen actors do. And I always kind of roughly follow the Woody Allen model, in a sense, is that I will always let them do what they do, because their version, even if you've written the lines, their version of what you've written is probably better, or potentially better than the way the rhythms that you've written in your head. And so, you know, I think I said on the DVD when I there's a line, a silly little joke in Severance, where he says, "Have you ever taken anything seriously in your life?" And he says, "Ecstasy and weed, I think." And it was Danny Dyer's line, but the way I'd written it was, the way you're meant to say it is ecstasy and weed, like a kind of terrible sitcom kind of delivery. So every time Danny was doing it, and he was doing it really much funnier than I'd written it, you kind of have to learn that they spent a lot of time looking at those lines, often looking in mirrors, some actors, and practicing what they're going to do, that they've given the line more thought than maybe you have in writing it often. So I try to let them do their thing first, and then little tweaks. And I mean, working with someone like Sean was amazing. Sean Bean's an incredibly technical, actor. That when he did his first takes on, and obviously I was a bit nervous, because you still, even though within a day or so you forget who you're with, certain people you still feel a bit kind of like Sean Bean, because he's a proper fellow, and you're working with him. And his very first day, he does a scene where, and he did the scene brilliantly. And he played the scene. He said to me, "Shall I do it a bit quicker?" And it completely worked at the pace he'd done it. And so he said, "Yeah, try a bit quicker. Let's give it another go." He shot it again, and it was quicker. And both versions completely work slightly differently. So you find that with actors, you can do so much more than does it work the way I want it. You can actually tweak it in the, they're like, you can do so much with a really good actor. It makes your life a lot easier.
Just getting as many. I guess as a director, you want to get their point of view straight away, because it's all about giving yourself options. Because it's our job, I guess, to pick the best things and take the credit.
Yeah, I think once you're in rhythm with each other, I mean, I certainly had that rhythm with Severance. I certainly had that rhythm more so with Black Death. You really are just doing tiny little tweaks. You kind of, let's just try making that a little bit more, put a bit more energy into it, make it try it a little bit more scared, or these really simple notes that just is because they're getting the rhythm and they're in the zone so much that I think that once it gets going, it can be a very easy job if you and all the actors are really locked into what you're doing. It can be tricky when you're permanently pushing people to go, because they've got their reason for doing something, and you think it's wrong, and you just have to go and front them out sometimes. And I mean, even in my short film, I worked with Brian Pringle, who's a lovely actor, but a very seasoned actor, and I was literally just made my first short film, and I felt that he was, being a bit too big for the scene. I was doing it very Alan Clark style, and I think he was acting a bit too. He wasn't acting; he was acting really well. And so I went up to him and said, "Could you just?" I was faffing around with him, trying to tell him how to. He goes, "Are you asking me to just do it less big?" And I went, "Yeah, okay, fine." And he just does it less big. And I've learned that you have to just be honest with an actor, if you think, because they respect you for being honest with them.
You were talking a little bit about subtext before. I was just wondering how important you feel that is to a film.
I think subtext is everything to a film. I think the best. So just talking solely in horror movies, the best horror movies have all got very strong subtext. Look at Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The McCarthy trials, witch hunts, Witchfinder General, the whole idea again of witch hunt. What was the? It just goes on. I mean, if you look at even the stuff like the slasher movies of the early 70s, and you look at those films, to me they're all Vietnam films because they all deal with images shot in a very real way, which totally ties into the images that were coming back to the American people. All the things that horror touches on, I think, makes the film scarier. So with Black Death, I wanted the film, it was a religious fundamentalist time. For me, that's the scary thing of our times, I think. In terms of the thing that keeps me up at night, I wouldn't want to be, in a scenario like you see these poor guys on videos that have been kidnapped. That's horror to me. So to try and take that, I wanted to put some of that subtext into the idea of hunting down a witch, the idea of how the state creates fear, because there's two sides to it. There's the real fear you have of being killed, and being captured, and the fear that's created with the idea of us needing to make a demon in order to have wars. And so I wanted to put that into the film. And I think what subtext does in those things is that you have the one level story that's working that an audience can like, and then you can find out what that movie was about that, and you go, of course it was, and it's hidden away. But I think it's there for you if you want to read that. I think it has it, certainly in horror, it has another undercurrent, which is that while part of your brain is thinking about a subtext that's going through it, you're able to scare them in another way, I believe.
Yeah.
I think that I think you watch horror movies and parts of your brain deal with certain parts of the images, I believe. And so when you watch something that feels sleazy, and you watch a sleazy horror movie, and you sort of go, this is, I don't know, and you watch certainly those ones from the early 70s, they feel as though the filmmakers aren't responsible people. So you feel like you're engaged in a kind of a process with someone who's not following the kind of a sort of a mandate of acceptability. So when you see those movies remade by studios, it's very hard with a film like Last House on the Left, which was a very sleazy film when it was made. When you remake that, you kind of have to put a bit of sleazy in. For me, that takes away the idea of why they did it at the time. And again, the subtext of those films at the time makes the way they handled it, and the fact it was the first time it had happened permissible.
Yeah.
So horror's strange, yeah.
I think, just on that point, I remember John Landis said something about how when you watch a Hitchcock film, you know you're in the hands of a master, but when you watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you felt like you was in the hands of a master.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Out of control.
That's exactly what it is. And so you feel, in some ways, like, even though Hitchcock made Psycho, you feel like everything's happening because he's a master. You feel safer with it because you know he's not going to do something really sleazy. There's not going to be accidents happening in those films. I love the example though. Imagine making The Exorcist now. If I wrote the script for The Exorcist, I handed The Exorcist in for development. Now say that's your first script. There's no novel, there's no book of The Exorcist, just that script. What would happen when it hits the development desks? Would they go, that scene with the crucifix, we can't have that.
Yeah, exactly.
And in fact, I don't even think you would write that scene with the crucifix, not because you think they would cut it, but because you would self-censor yourself, because you would think, because we're so different now from how we believe, the way we behaved in the 70s, we're so less liberal now, we're so much more conservative in the way we make stories. Even though you hear all this stuff about video nastiness and violence in the cinema, I think we're much more conservative in our approach. And this is coming from someone who did that scene in Creep. I believe that we cut things, we censor ourselves.
But yeah, when you talk about Creep, I think it's all those bits, the unconventional bits, which is what makes that film a little bit more scary. And it's kind of fun, because when you see Creep doing the monkey bars and kind of running around, that stuff's kind of funny, but it's kind of scary as well, because you don't quite know what you
Well, that's exactly where I got all that from. It was from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. When you watch the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I didn't find it remotely funny. No. At one point, he's running around slapstick style, almost skipping like he's in a Harold Lloyd movie, and it kind of adds to the chaos and the madness is what I think is successful in there. I met Sean for a drink, Sean Harris, the actor, the other day. We were talking about it. It's that unconventional stuff that makes it stay in your mind more so than a film that's very slick, very well made in the slick sense, but very boring because it hasn't got madness in it. You need to put madness into it, I think.
A lot of directors kind of worry about getting pigeonholed in a genre, and you've obviously proven, I guess you've made horror films, but they're also sort of delve into different genres and different things as well. Was that deliberate to kind of show that you could do more, or just to keep?
Definitely, there was definitely Severance was a response to if I had a negative review in Creep, it would be, oh, it's like a cliche. And I was like, well, mate, not doing those things is really easy. I was trying to do something with Creep that would make you, as you've described, feel a bit unclean and hark back to those movies of the early 70s. So to turn conventions on their head, that was the whole idea that Severance was. And then after that, I then, again, as I said, straight after Creep, but before I was given Severance, because Severance was written by James Moran and I worked on it with him, but it was originally his script. Straight after Creep, in response to, wanting to show that I can do something smart, I started writing Triangle. So I would never, I don't believe, have been able to have financed Triangle on the back of just Creep. I had to make a film that also had that played with conventions a bit more. So fortunately, Severance came. So I'd written the draft, I think it was 2004 when I wrote Triangle, but then I had this whole long period where I didn't do anything with it until 2008. So.
Would you be happy just to make horror films right your entire career?
Well, I'm just working with Sarah Radcliffe to do a series of books at the moment called Cherub, which is kind of I say it's kind of Shane Meadows Spy Kids. It's not like that, but the characters feel like they're Shane Meadows characters, and they're a series of spy books. So I want to do that, but it's like naughty humour, so it's very it's like Severance humour, but for kids. So it's kind of very similar in that respect. But then I'm thinking of other ideas. I'm just doing a film noir at the moment that has a very dark murder in it. And then I'm just thinking about doing a werewolf movie. So I find that as soon as I get away from it, I just want to do a werewolf film. I want to do a Jack the Ripper film. I think they're just cool. I want to do all sorts of stuff, but I do love making horror movies. I just wish that horror movies, with the exception of Silence of the Lambs, maybe The Exorcist. I mean, The Exorcist is one of the best films ever made. It should have been had more accolades at the time, I believe, as for what a good film it was. And I think that what happens is every year the BAFTAs come round and you feel like if you even touch on horror, you're gonna you need to make a costume drama or something. There's often I think you've got to understand that making movies is a collaborative process from the beginning to the end. Unless you're Stanley Kubrick, you're gonna have to.
Have you ever had a point where there's almost too many cooks and too many
always. There's always that. You're always going, that's my favourite scene, and then if someone's got it in for that scene, you start to obsess over they've got it in for that scene, and often it's not that. They want you to passionately fight for it, but I don't believe that you can passionately fight until the point where you alienate yourself. I don't do that. I like to, I will passionately fight for something if I believe in it. And it's hard for someone to say, if the director and maybe the writer-director and the editor are passionately fighting for it, for you to come in and say, I don't agree, that takes a certain type of producer or a certain type of executive to say that. And if they do, they'll have their reasons for it, and you can often find a common ground, usually. But if you don't, if you say, okay, well, for example, I've never had Final Cut, if you've got Final Cut and you think you're Mr. Powerful, you're not Mr. Powerful, because if you've got Final Cut and you go against the distributor's opinions entirely, they just won't release it with the same passion or the same belief that they would have if. So it's a tricky balance, really. You can't, I mean, I read this thing about Polanski was a week behind. He's 2 weeks into making Chinatown, he was already a week behind or something. So I sort of read like, well, I can take a bit more time with the scene if I want. Polanski was a week behind, and then you get the vultures on you going, oh, you're a day behind, Chris. You're going to have to cut something from the script.
Are they there hovering on set over your shoulder?
Not over your shoulder. I've never had that. I've been lucky. I did on Triangle. I had someone that was always an invisible presence because the machine was, it was a bigger budget and we had a lot less time, I think, than we needed to make that film. But I've never had the experience that you hear about happening in Hollywood, where you get a job as a hired hand, for example. You read a script, they get you to come and do it, and you've got 7 execs asking you to permanently. That would drive me nuts.
Yeah,
I don't know. That would be really hard.
Do you want to work on something that's commercially viable, or is it just happens? It just happens.
I think I have commercial ideas. I just always have, and I think that's what drives me, is to make those kind of movies that are naturally, those sort of films that that's what I do. That's what the films are. And that's not the films I watch necessarily as well. I love to watch real art house cinema. I'm a passionate lover of cinema, but it doesn't mean I could make a film like Kiarostami or a film like Kieslowski. I couldn't. So and that's not for me to do. That's for those guys to do, I think.
Yeah.
So I think I'm lucky in that respect. I think the hard part is when you fall between the rock and the hard place, when your films are not art house enough and are not commercial enough. Those are the films that are the tricky ones that try and avoid making.
Yeah, I think your stuff's definitely commercial, but it's still a bit quirky and idiosyncratic, and that's why the certain things work better for, say, me than maybe.
Yeah,
I don't know, you know.
that's right. But I think I do want to make a kind of movie. I think I should now try and make a movie that just, that just hits them, that does all those interesting, quirky things, but does it in a mainstream commercial way as well.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try and find what that Nightmare on Elm Street is, or that, because I think I want to do that now. The answer to your question is I do want to make a real big smash, but I've got to try and keep the things that interest me as well.